And I'm really pleased that we get to continue to have these conversations in partnership with CEONet, an affinity group that has long been a network of CEOs in the field to create positive peer engagement, you know, and educational value. And thank you, Dan Templin, and your entire crew, who's been working hard to revamp that effort and try to reestablish the network. And you were coming together in person in April in Detroit with us at CFUnited conference, and then that all went sideways, and so we're finding new ways to connect. So thank you to CEONet. You know, this is really interesting how this all came together. We had the CFUnited conference plenaries that were set to take place in Detroit, and then as many of you probably hopefully know or have seen, we shifted those to in-person or virtual conversations, and it was quite the enjoyable conversation with Isaiah, Mackenzie, Mike, and Neil during that first session. And so we wanted to bring them into this conversation, but because they did such a good job of talking about what's front and center in our nation and our country, you know, about talking in particular about the shortcomings of our own field when it comes to race and when it comes to change and diversity, I wanted to make sure that that thread was still here today. And, you know, just to set the tone, this is no secret, I'm a white male, and so this is a tough conversation for me to be leading or to be having when I want it really to be focused on creating engagement for minority voices so that we can hear directly from those diverse experiences and the lived experiences of those who are doing this. So I feel really honored to be able to host this particular one with my colleague and my friend Deanna James from St. Croix Foundation in the Virgin Islands. And for any of you who participated in our old CEO roundtables when we were doing them in person, we always had someone host them with us when we were in their city, whether it be Tucson or Miami or DC. And so I'm pretending that I'm on the Virgin Islands with Deanna, and so all of you can too. So, you know, pull out your sunscreen if you need to. But this conversation I just be very clear, I'm going to name it, you know, we are talking about race. It is difficult, but for me, this is about how we grow. This is how we face these challenges together to hopefully incorporate it into our day-to-day lives, and frankly, to be better stewards of responding to our community and be better foundation leaders. So I just wanted to name that, you know, up front and say that we certainly are going to ground this in just building community with each other. And so that includes all of us, that includes all of our voices in this. And I couldn't be happier with the friends who are joining us on this hour. So I want to stop talking, and I want to turn it over to Deanna to allow you to have that conversation with some really cool peers that are willing to spend their time with us. So Deanna, please take it away, and thank you so much for hosting with me today.
Thank you, Brad. Welcome, everyone. This is a real honor to be hosting such an important conversation. Like I said, during the pop-up conversation I was a part of, Brad has joined us here on St. Croix as we have led some important conversations about race. And despite the fact that I live in a predominantly Black community, the same structural issues, systemic issues around racism exist here. And they're unique because in so many ways we don't have a vote or a voice. And so that conversation has been an important one for us to have, in addition to conversations around colonization and the ways in which, you know, it shows up in a community like ours. So I'm so honored to continue this conversation. And for the first part of this roundtable, we'll be inviting some of the CEOs who were part of the pop-ups. I was part of one. And then there was some radicals that were part of the first one. And I have to admit that I plugged in just to get a peek at what was the sort of the lay of the land in preparation for my pop-up, and then I couldn't tear myself away from it. It was so engaging, and I was like, who are these people? How did Brad corral the same mindset into one pop-up session? The conversation was really dynamic, and I'm really honored to be able to facilitate ongoing conversations. The second roundtable will be with my new friend, LaDon Sullivan, who I am so honored. I told Brad after we had a little prep session yesterday that I was slightly uncomfortable leading a conversation with LaDon. She's such a dynamic human being. So, but she'll have a lot to share with us about the work she's leading at the Denver Foundation. So we're going to kick it off, and I'm going to just invite our panel to the fore, and that is Isaiah Oliver, who's the President and CEO of Community Foundation of Greater Flint, Mackenzie Sundblin, Executive Director of the Huron County Community Foundation, Mike Gorehouse, President and CEO of the Community Foundation of Holland, Zealand, and Sarah Owen, who's the President and CEO of Southwest Florida Community Foundation.
And Deanne, I'll just flag real quickly that Sarah's not going to be able to join us.
She's not.
She had a last minute conflict, but please carry on. You've got three awesome individuals.
I got like the creme de la creme.
You're okay. Yep.
So I'm going to start with a little story. So a year ago, I was in Jamaica at a Wings conference, and a gentleman who is now a friend of our foundation stood up and he said a little prayer, and the prayer was that there would be some massive flashpoint in the world that would poke and prod philanthropy to do radical things. I had to reach out to him a couple of months ago and ask him if all this chaos in the world was his doing, because I think this was the kind of flashpoint he was talking about. So I have been inspired by this. And we really had a deep conversation in Jamaica about what it would take for philanthropy to be, courageous and bold in how we do our work, how we think about the practice of the field. And I was really, I called Brad right after the first pop-up session with Mike and Mackenzie and Isaiah. And I was like, who are these people? Like, they give me life. I was so inspired by how unapologetic you were in talking about the ways in which you are moving the needle in your organizations. So I'm going to just start. Mackenzie, we kind of talked a little bit about this, but are there ways in which you got feedback from your conversation that makes you feel hopeful about how people receive the conversation that you were part of?
Yeah, it was kind of fun. I hopped on LinkedIn afterwards, and I had a couple of messages from folks from across the country, and many of them were one-person shops. They were the small shops, and they sent messages that were like, "It was so great to hear from you," or they were rural serving, unapologetically rural serving, right? Like, we live in the rural, we work in the rural, and that's our only service area. Just because those weren't voices that they were used to seeing on a national platform. And so being able to really shine the light on the people who don't have a full marketing team, like we are our own marketing team, we are our own finance team, and we are our own donor engagement team, and still being able to see how we can meaningfully engage in the work, not only of the work of our foundation, but also the work that our field needs to do. So those were some fun conversations that I was able to have after the pop-up from people who saw their kind of journey and their philanthropic struggles, if you will, represented in our conversation.
I relate to that more than I can express, coming from an island. I always say that necessity is the mother of invention. And so the way that we practice philanthropy is informed by the landscape that we're serving. And so, people come here and they're like, that's like a really different model of philanthropy. And I'm like, yeah, it has to be. Like, we don't have the same level of resources that other foundations have. And so we have to do things differently. And in many ways, I'll say this, that the things that seemed like we had to do it because we were under-resourced are now things that it seems are becoming, trends in the field. And so in some ways we are trailblazers. Isaiah, you really lit the screen up when you were talking during your pop session. You were really the person that, like, as I was getting ready to unplug, because I was like, okay, I figure how this works, I couldn't stop listening. Can you talk about the feedback? Because there's always the concern that you go too far, that the conversation, that the field is not ready for the conversation that we're having. And so I'm just always interested, what was the feedback? How did people receive what you had to say?
So it's interesting that you say that. I will tell you the best feedback I received was from Kathleen Enright. She wrote us a really nice note, thanking us for our participation and thanking us for figuring out where the line was and then making an intentional decision to step over it. I have not, you talk about this idea where people are actually engaging in the work and happy that you said something, but then they kind of give you feedback that they weren't sure you're going to do it. That's not the world that I live in. And so, I've been pretty consistent about being unapologetic about race, about how we center equity in our work, and how the field of philanthropy actually needs to change. We have to reckon with our reality, our history, the history of this country. And I'll be quite honest, if I could not be or bring my 100% full true self to the work, then I would probably find other work to do. And so I'm thankful for the opportunity to be my full self, to bring that to the table, to bring that to whatever conversations I'm invited to. But I'm also thankful to folks who would rather not have my voice at the table, not inviting me, because then I don't have to worry about hurting feelings. And so I'm so thankful that so many people are here today to continue this conversation, because I think it's a needed conversation. But being able to carry that unapologetic spirit into every conversation I jump into is important for me, keeps me grounded. And it's just amazing to have folks like Mike and Mackenzie and Neil to have those candid conversations with, because I don't know everything, clearly. None of us do, but the reality is iron sharpens iron. We're all in this work together. There are over 900 community foundations all over this country trying to figure out how to make our communities better places. And so who better to have these conversations with than our peers?
Thank you, Mike. So you were kind of interesting in your conversation because you serve a very conservative community. And I actually related to that. That's really interesting. The Virgin Islands, despite what people may think, is a very conservative space. And we built this consortium of nonprofits that, despite the fact that the island is predominantly Black, our partners in the field are very diverse. And when we started this conversation about race, I personally was very reticent because I wasn't sure how some of our white partners would receive the conversation. And it was one of my very dear friends, a white revolutionary, who stood up and said, "Deanna, I'll kick it off for you. I'll lead the conversation." And 3 and 4 years later, we are having some of the deepest conversations that are probably happening in the Caribbean right here on St. Croix because of that. So I was really inspired and just also really concerned about how your participation and conversation would be received by the community you serve.
It's funny you asked that, Deanna. I don't think you were actually on our planning call, but I actually asked our team in the planning session if they were going to record it and how far the COF was going to spread it. And it was half jokingly, half serious. I mean, and what I mean by that is not because anything I said, it was something I don't believe in. That's not it at all. I think one of the things that I've appreciated about this dialogue and the friendship and relationship that we have with Mackenzie, Isaiah, and Neil especially, is we have to acknowledge that different things cost different amounts in different communities to say or do. They just do, right? In certain communities, to take a certain action may seem like you're way behind the times or right in the center of times or way ahead of the times. The same exact action or making the same exact statement. You know, we could have posted the same thing on social media across all 55 community foundations that are on this call right now. And for some, it would have been the wrong thing to say. Some would have been the right thing to say. And some would have been the wrong thing to say because it wasn't bold enough, right? I mean, there's all these things. And so for me, what I appreciate, and it builds on what Isaiah was saying, is that we need each other to help push each other, because we could always look to conservative communities and point out the things that we need to do different. And believe me, I got them. I got a long list of things we got to do different. But what does it look like for me to have people, pushing me to be bold, to lead more, to lead further? And is there also an ability to then look at more progressive, right? Or might have said a lot of the right things and be able to say words that make us feel good, but question too, what risk have you taken, right? Where have you pushed further? Where can you be more bold? And I like that. I like when we can kind of push each other on that with a spirit of humility, but we're also trying to advance each of our communities forward. Because I believe this. I believe this is a time when we need conservative communities, progressive communities, any rural communities, urban communities. I don't care what kind of community you're leading. We need all of us taking steps forward if we're going to make change. So, yeah, so they I don't know if it's good or bad, but none of my board members, I don't think, watched the pop up. But I wish a few of them would have, but I didn't hear anything from the board members. But the field, I think people appreciate the honesty, right? And if you're in a conservative community, I'll say it like I said in that call. First off, you better show up. So you better be in this game. There's no excuses. I don't care. I've seen it. There's no excuses. You got to show up. But I want to also acknowledge that it's okay to name that a certain action or words may cost you differently or more or whatever than somewhere else. It's not an excuse not to show up, but also let's be really strategic about the work that you do so you can continue to live to fight another day too.
So one of the things that we have an annual report going on, and the title of it is Disruptive Philanthropy. We consider ourselves to be disruptors. And we have some strained relationships with local stakeholders because of it. We're always prodding and pushing ourselves and our partners to go further. I think about this work. I'm incredibly passionate about the field of philanthropy. And often disappointed because I feel like the voice of those of us who are ready to go, to step over the line are muted at times when we all gather together. I sit on a planning committee for a major philanthropic association, and they had a session that they were designing. I hope nobody on this session is here today, but they had a session that was called Philanthropy Shift. And they asked everyone to pick which planning committee they wanted to be on. And I was like, oh, that's the one I want to be on. And I got there and they were like, yeah, how is philanthropy going to shift resources to address COVID or to address climate change or whatever the issue is? And I was like, well, that's not why I joined. I thought that this was going to be a much more introspective process. Like, how are we going to think about our role and how we have contributed to the condition of our communities today? And they said, oh God, that's such a great way to think about the title. We didn't think about it that way. I stepped away, wasn't part of, I think, one meeting, and I got back and they were back on course to talk about the way that philanthropy is going to respond. And I was just really disappointed. And so I'm curious, Mackenzie, if you can talk about, you serve a community very similar, like a small community. I serve a very small organization in a small community. How do you see the field, the readiness of the field to move in the direction that you are trying to take it? You have been, from the time you stepped on to your organization and you held your board's feet to the fire. You were moving and shaking things around, and I just am interested in your level of optimism about the field's readiness to actually make this shift.
So I'm uniquely positioned that Michigan has an incredibly robust youth grant making program. And so my community foundation, like most of the community foundations in the state of Michigan, has a youth grant making board. They have their own endowment. They're often making their own priorities. And I'm really optimistic because I see the work they're doing. And I think we all could do really well to maybe stop thinking we know as much and look at what they're doing. I know Mike has a really great example of how youth were leading in his community on some really tough topics, but there was another community foundation in Michigan that their youth grant makers got together and decided that they were going to host a book reading. They gave out free books, the Hate You Give, to anyone in their community that wanted to read that book, and they hosted a discussion on it themselves. So I think, especially with the large leadership transition that we're seeing in the field of philanthropy right now, the fact that you have my generation and younger that's actually coming out of school saying, I want to pursue a career in philanthropy versus philanthropy is what we've done after we've finished our real job. Then we come back and we give back to the community by jumping into philanthropy. I think those two things make me optimistic that we can continue to move this progress forward.
Appreciate that. Isaiah, are you optimistic about the readiness of the field to move in the direction of evolution and progress?
I am optimistic, or again, I probably wouldn't be in this space. I just got caught reading the question that Walker Sanders just posted. I apologize. And Walker is probably one of a few members, a small group of members. That's the reason why I'm in this field. I was a kid from the north side of Flint that had no understanding of what philanthropy did or what it was in my community. I just cared about making my community a better place. And he encouraged my then CEO to hire this young, talkative kid from the north side of Flint to serve as a VP in the organization. I've learned a great deal about the field of philanthropy over that time period. I mean, over my last 6-7 years in the field. And I think the opportunity for us is right now, we have a global reckoning with race and culture and what it means. And we also are all in this place where we realize that we're only at our best when everyone in our community has what it needs to contribute to making our communities better places. And if you take a look at your community and you realize that there are voices that need to be amplified, there are groups that have been marginalized, if you're not being intentional about adding those voices to the conversation, then you're doing your community a disservice. And I think in philanthropy, we've realized that philanthropy itself isn't enough. More specifically, charity isn't enough. And so we have to figure out how we leverage the social capital that every person, every group in our community brings to making it better, and then using that and propelling it forward. I think we're all at that place where we recognize it, and now we have to figure out how we do it. The earlier question you asked was about readiness of the field, and then you kind of asked Mackenzie a question about how she was pushing or engaging her board. I think the reality is we got to be thoughtful about what the board's role is. Our board's role is to decide on where we're going. I mean, quite frankly, literally to tell us where to go. They hire CEOs, much like the folks in this room, to help you get to where they decided they were going to go, whether it's a strategic framework or a strategic planning process, but they're going to lay out where you're going, and then it's your role to get you there. And that's where the partnership starts. So if my board didn't already decide that we were going to center racial equity, they didn't already decide that we were going to amplify the voices of our residents, they didn't already decide that we were going to lean into policy and systems change, that there will be very little work for me to do. And so that partnership matters a whole lot in our work. And at the moment where you feel like where the board wants to go and where your leadership is taking the organization is two different places, then you have some career decisions to make. And so that's just my response to both the question you asked me and then tagging in a little bit to Mackenzie's question.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So Mike, I'm a member. We were, the Virgin Islands was included in the Southeastern Council's map, which was one of the goals that we set for ourselves to get on the map. And it's been interesting to be part of that because a lot of the organizations that sit in the Southeastern Council are conservative organizations and conservative communities. And so I'm always very, very in tune to the push and pull of conversations about racial equity and how ready organizations are. And it almost always seems like the staff, the leadership of the organization at the staff level is ready. The board is not always as ready as they are. And so, Mike, I'm just really interested in your community, if you see an overall readiness for your community and your work to move forward and philanthropy to evolve around issues around race.
Yeah, no, they're not ready, but we're never going to be ready. If we're sitting around waiting for folks to be ready to talk about race and to stand up against racism and confront all the things that have built our society in the way they are, we're going to be waiting a long time, folks. So I don't think ready is what we should be waiting for. And I agree with Isaiah 110% that board matters a ton. Like we all know this, we're CEOs, like the board matters a ton. And there are times when you just gotta lean and push through the board. And I think this is one of those times. And I agree that whether that may mean that you don't get to think about your career, that may be that they get to think about your career and you gotta decide what to do with that, but that's okay. I just think if we're waiting for a bunch of white folks around town to get ready, it's gonna be a long slog. So the short answer is not ready, don't care, you gotta do it. Second, I will say I'd like to answer your broader question and push a little bit. My two colleagues here were pretty optimistic about the readiness of the field to have some shifts and change. And I'll tell you, I'm not so sure. And I'll tell you 3 reasons why. I think incentives matter. At the end of the day, I trust people to make self-sacrifice to a certain point, but the incentive structure matters for organizations and people. And let me give you 3 incentive structures that are not helping our field really reckon with the change that's needed. So 1, we get most of our money from major donors. It's just a fact. Add up to 52 communications on this call and see where the dollars come from. It's mostly for major donors, I would guess. I would hazard a very strong guess. So first off, we are built, whether it was in the past or in the present, on resources that came from people who benefited from the systems the way they are, first and foremost, okay? Second, many of us are endowment-based organizations, which means the whole endowment model is built on investing dollars for a long-term return. Most of us, even if we're in some sort of private equity, hedge funds, or other kinds of things, depend a lot on the public markets. Guess what, folks? The public markets depend on the systems more or less the way that they are. So in order for you to generate your 5% to either give out in grants or take in your fees, you need the markets to go up. I know what you were doing back in end of March, early April, like I was. You were trying to figure out what happened to your assets, what was going to happen to your fees, what was going to happen to your grants. You wanted the markets to bounce back. We all did in some extent. But the problem is the fact that we want markets to bounce back, I think might be in conflict with some of the other change that we're trying to achieve in our community. So that's a second disincentive misalignment, I think. And the third is, for many communities, being CEO of the Community Foundation is probably one of the best jobs in town. We don't want to lose that job. We probably get paid as much or more than any other nonprofit leader in our town. We have more influence and we can show up in any space we want to. We get invited to every table. It's long-term endowment. Budgeting is not really that hard compared to our peers and all kinds of other kinds of things. So at the end of the day, there's an incentive structure for CEOs of community foundations, myself included. I'm not pointing fingers at anyone else. Let me tell you, I've run the math. If I get fired, where I'm going to go work in my town, I've done the math about what that means for my personal income and my family and other kinds of things. The reality is I'm just naming that I think there's a disincentive for us as leaders to want to push hard for the change that may be needed in the community because we like our jobs. So for me, I would say I'm less optimistic. I like to be an optimistic person in the world that we can bear through that. I just want to name that those are 3 at the top of my head that I think are structural things that would push us day in and day out to not make the kind of change that we actually need in our communities.
So Mike, do you think the leadership turnover that's happening right now, because I mean, it's no secret, right? We've been talking about the generational turnover for a while and community foundations are not immune to that. Do you think that will help those? Because a couple of those are directly related to leadership. Are you willing to be Isaiah that shows up unapologetically, or are you comfortable inside of the system that molded you that you're just going to kind of sit on your hands and be okay?
I don't know. I mean, it's a good question, Mackenzie. I would say the first 2 about major donors and investments probably have less to do with leadership and leadership turnover. That's a structural thing, I think.
Right.
It could be interesting. But just the third one about leadership, I don't know, because I'd like to point my fingers at myself. I mean, I'm trying to lead boldly, but at the end of the day, I'd rather not lose my job. I'm just being vulnerable with you guys. Like, and I'm going to hazard a guess that Mackenzie and Isaiah don't want to lose their jobs either. And so I'm not saying that it requires you to lose your job to be leading well. Don't hear me say that. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I am trying to say that I think it takes each of us holding each other accountable. So to that point, Mackenzie, if us as leaders, whether you've been in the field for 30 years, 10 years, or 1 year, if we can hold each other accountable to pushing each other to lead in the change that we want to make in the world. I know some 25-year Community Foundation CEO vets that are doing some really darn good work and leading boldly. And I know some young folks that aren't stepping up. So I think, at the end of the day, to me, it's more about, can we push each other, hold each other accountable to be the kind of leaders that our community needs? Then we'll be cool. And if it takes turnover to get there, then that's fine. If it takes me getting out of the way, that's fine too. But I think that's what we're going to need.
So there's some really great conversations happening in the chat. really around diversity of donors, and hopefully we can address some of that in our next roundtable. We get to talk to LaDawn and the work that she's leading at the Denver Foundation, but it is an important conversation. What I didn't say when I got started, and I was talking about that bold statement that was made by my colleague in Jamaica, was he actually said, I wasn't gonna, Mike, since you went there, I'm gonna tell you what he said. He actually said he wished that something like radical would happen with endowments. Whether it was with the markets that would force foundations to actually have to think differently about that structure that you're talking about, the system that we all sort of serve. We serve it a little less because of how grassroots we are. And so we have tried really hard to be as self-sustaining. And so we're not beholden to donors. We're not beholden to that system that I think has rooted a lot of these issues around race, and the ability for philanthropy to really move the needle on this and to get out of their comfort zone. So I think that we have a lot of work to do, Mike, and there are times when I'm not very optimistic either. So I really appreciate your comments on that. Brad, can you just poke me about time, how we are with time?
Brad, you're muted.
Yeah.
All right, how about that? Sorry, it's about 2:34 Eastern time, so it would be awesome because based on what Walker was bringing up about 99% of the field being, or donors being white, this is something that LaDawn and Community Investment Network have actually practically helped break that barrier down. So maybe we, and Mackenzie, Isaiah, Mike, as always, thanks for your honesty and your feedback, and stay with us because you might have something to add here. But Deanna, I think it'd be great to swing over to Marcia and Deanna, or LaDawn, sorry.
So yeah, we're going to transition over to LaDawn Sullivan. I had the incredible pleasure of having a really rich conversation with her and Marcia Morgan yesterday. Marcia is on the call also. She'll be piping in as needed. Marcia is from the Community Investment Network, and today, hopefully we'll be able to provide an overview of the work that's being led at CIN, and then how LaDawn has taken that work and sort of embedded it in the foundation that she serves. So just to give everybody a little bit of background, LaDawn is another change agent. She's another radical on the panel. And for 22 years, she's been pushing the needle on social justice and racial equity for low-income communities of color. She currently manages programs for that support emerging leaders of color, including the executive directors of Color Institute. So I'm just so honored to be able to facilitate this conversation. LaDawn, why don't you start out by talking a little bit about your role before we get into CIN and the work that you helped to spearhead at CIN. Talk a little bit about your role at the Denver Foundation.
Thank you, Deanna, and thanks to everybody who's here. So I've been at the foundation 23 years as of July, and I was the 8th employee. Just to kind of give people a little bit of context to where we were in our journey to here. When I began at the foundation, our corpus was 65 million. We're now close to $1 billion. So I don't know if that kind of helps you think about the trajectory of growth. And as I said, I was the 8th employee, and now we have close to 50. So that just kind of gives you a sense of our growth over that 20+ year period. In that time, like immediately right before I was hired, the Denver Foundation actually was reviewed by some external evaluators, and we received information that we were very white, that our organization, in essence, was an ivory tower that was sprinkling money down to nonprofits who were the voice of the communities that they served, and they were telling the foundation what was needed for those communities to have the supports that they needed. We weren't hearing from the actual folks that live in the communities that we say we support. So when we're saying we're working with vulnerable communities, which I don't necessarily love that term, but more so low income and communities of color, those voices were not resonating on our board, nor on our community-facing committees, or in our engagement. And so when I came onto the foundation, I actually lived in one of those neighborhoods, and I was in the finance department, believe it or not. And as I have told the folks in prepping for this call, I was extremely nosy in every area of the foundation except for finance. And so I was exploring into our programmatic area, and then much later into our donor engagement and philanthropic services area. With that being said, I've really been fortunate to be maybe kind of an inside and outside voice, and I would say have served in some capacity as a door opener as we began to explore becoming more diverse, becoming more inclusive, and building racially equitable practices. That's been all the way from us engaging in a small grants program that does not require 501c3 status for groups of people from the communities, from low income and communities of color, specifically bringing forth their ideas and building on the existing assets in their communities and using the small dollars that we offer to leverage what they, I would say, their assets, their time, their talent, their voices, their relationships and networks to actually create the change that they wish to see in their communities. That's been a 20-year program that really was the launching pad for the Denver Foundation to step into our inclusiveness work, where we were looking at how can we actually be supportive of the nonprofit and philanthropic landscape to move beyond diversity, beyond counting how many people of color in the room, but actually creating intentional inclusive tables where those folks were at the table and they were part of the decision-making, the development, the implementation, the evaluation, and I would say most importantly, the disbursement of dollars and resources. And that work has continued to live really as a part of the Denver Foundation's evolving DNA and how we work in the broader Denver community. I now am the Director of Leadership and Equity for the Foundation, which is housed in our programmatic department. But as I said before, always nosy. I'm always in the other side. So now I'm heavily involved kind of in partnership with our donor department. And that's kind of where my relationship with CIN really began. What we recognize, I would say, maybe a lesson learned as we have moved from being a knowing organization to a learning organization is that the folks that we work with in community, they have the solutions, they know what they need. And we need to be helpful in sometimes stepping back and following their leadership, sometimes standing beside and helping to amplify their voices, and sometimes utilizing our influence and our power to cut the path to get them where they want to go. And so that work really resonates in the work that I now do at the Denver Foundation, which includes, as Deanna mentioned, thanks so much, our Executive Directors of Color Institute. That literally was co-created by EDs of color in the broader metro area who said, we are tired of being the only person of color in these capacity building rooms, expected to set aside our history, the roots of how our organizations were formed, and be molded into this cookie cutter model of what it means to be a successful nonprofit in our community. We know our community. We have a right to hold the roots of our history, our race, our culture as a part of who we are. And we would want an intentional space where we can have conversations about how to utilize those best practices that will be important for us to be sustainable, but meld that with who we are as people of color, as leaders of color. And so that program's 9 years strong. We have about 140 alumni, and we have 40 individuals in that program this year. It's a 2-year program. And I would say too, my work doesn't just rest only with people of color. So in light of our inclusiveness work, we've also lifted up what we're calling the landscape cohort that's new this year. It is a cohort of 20 organizations, 10 white-led and 10 people of color-led organizations who have specifically mapped out a year's journey of what they think is needed for them to progress in building racially equitable and inclusive practices for their organization. We provide a small grant, but we also provide the opportunity for them to come together and caucus. So they caucus white-led only, people of color only, as well as integrated conversations about how they're moving this work forward, so that we can create some trusted space for white organizations who are like, I don't even know what to do, because that is a part of that conversation. And, you know, the feeling of loss or misstep and, you know, struggle to, I guess, make the perfect move, which, you know, we've come to find out there is no perfect move, so let that go. And then for people of color to also navigate what racial equity means for them, because that is also a part of their journey, but it's gonna look different than a white-led organization. And so we really want to hold space for them to also figure out and navigate what it means to organizations that are birthed and rooted in communities of color. Finally, I'll just add that kind of in our journey here, the Denver Foundation has had to walk its talk. So as I talk about us working with nonprofit organizations, we had to do the same thing. And our philosophy and practice is to be very vulnerable and open about our journey. We have had numerous missteps, numerous setbacks, lots of crying, and just keeping it real with everybody. And some triumphs, some really strong progression forward, as well as some strong practices and policies that when we look back over a 20-year journey, we see how far we've come, but we also look forward and know we have a long way to go. Go ahead, Deanna, sorry.
Dawn, I really appreciate that. That's such a powerful testimony, I think, for the journey, the walk that we have to walk when we're committed as organizations to moving the needle. I want to really pull Marcia into this conversation to really give as succinct as you can an overview of CIN. I'm still really inspired by the work you're leading and how, and then we'll try and connect how LaDawn was able to seamlessly sort of fold it into her work at Denver Foundation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marcia Morgan, Chair of the Community Investment Network. And so in 2004, our network was birthed with the formation of 2 giving circles. And since that time, our network has grown. And so now we have currently 19 circles across the country that we support, we provide technical resources for. But beyond that, we also have signature programming. And so one of our programs is targeted towards college students. And the other one is really targeted for foundations. And it's called Essentials for Diversity in Giving. And so that program really helps institutions, philanthropic institutions, understand how to engage with donors of color. The goal is to remove any barriers that may exist and to really allow foundations to realize, number one, community knows what community needs. And so being able to engage your community members in a way that is beneficial not only for your institution, but also for the community really reaps a lot of benefits. And so we come in and it's a workshop and it has several different components and activities to it. But ultimately, attendees are able to walk away with a better perspective on really just how to interact with communities of color so that they can have more diverse members engaged with their institution. The beauty of this work is that it's a curriculum that we've developed over time. And so LaDawn has been associated with CIN, I think you said yesterday, since like 2006, maybe for a number of years. And so the beauty of that is that she's even been able to see how the curriculum has evolved, but also how it is useful for a foundation. And so LaDawn, would you like to share more about how you all have benefited from being able to have access to EDGE?
Sure. So as I stated before, everything I talked about before kind of helped us be ready for our connection with CIN. It was I think it's one of the strongest parts of the recipe of our success thus far. So I initially attended a CIN conference a couple of years before, or a year before we actually made an official, I think, an official relationship on paper. But the principles and what I learned at that conference completely resonated and connected greatly with the work that we were already doing in working directly with leaders of color in the community. I think what it did is it married CIN's principles of elevating the 5 T's of time, talent, treasure, testimony, and social ties in a way that we saw that what might have been leaders of nonprofits and or our grantees, they directly are connected to what I think traditionally we see as donors, though it's not always about this big check. It's about how they're investing in community. And how do we as a community foundation begin to elevate that, I would say, the history and culture of giving in communities of color, and marry it to our core values of racial equity and community leadership. And so that really is where I think CIN and the Denver Foundation began to work together. One, to begin to break down this, the barrier of it's almost like the same language, but we're not speaking the same language. And so demystifying the language of philanthropy. So we weren't using the word philanthropy. We were talking about investment and giving, and talking about it and connecting the dots as to how our foundation kind of communicates philanthropy versus how philanthropy actually happens in communities of color, and beginning to marry those and elevate stories about how people of color are giving back in their communities. And also, I think through CIN and our relationship through CIN, beginning to strengthen this whole thought process around strategic investment and what that means, and sharing that as a unifying word amongst our existing donors, which are majority white, and our emerging donors of color. Also, you know, giving circles. So our first giving circle is made up of a group of African-American men who were our grantees in the small grants program I was mentioning to you. Building relationship with them over years and recognizing how they were investing their 5 T's was the linchpin of how we helped to bring them together. And we took some of them to a CIN conference where they got to see other people in the room who said, I am a donor of color, I am a philanthropist. So are you, did you know that? And then talking and sharing their stories about how they were giving back in their communities, whether they served as coaches, mentors, if they were actually mobilizing resources and beyond dollars, but dollars in there too, and leveraging those, and how they were lending their voice to make change in the community and really being the leaders. So creating an atmosphere where donors are teaching donors was a game changer. That first giving circle and our connection to CIN has birthed 4 more giving circles of color, multiple donors of color, individual donors of color who have donor advised funds and or are participating with us in numerous campaigns that we have had. And we also have some membership organization endowments at the foundation. And that really happened in a very short period of time. Within 6 years, we've mobilized a lot of energy. And I would say too, it's changed the Denver Foundation. So when you see our communication materials, you look on the cover, there are people of color, there are white people. You don't know who's a grantee and who's a donor, and that's on purpose. We want to make sure that everybody sees themselves as a partner of the Denver Foundation. Donor, leader, grantee, community partner, there's room in this tent for everybody. So it kind of helped us, I would say CIN really helped us shift from the tower mentality to a village mentality. And that's, you know, really speaks to what CIN is about.
I want to say that I'm so inspired by that. There's a couple of things that you said that are just resonating with me really powerfully. So we are, a small organization. Almost, I would say 99.9% of our donors are white. And for many years, my predecessor was a older white man from Maine who served as the head of this organization for 22 years. And I would, go with him to meetings with donors, and they would say, hey, you can't like keep depending on us all white guys to fund your work. And it was really frustrating. You've got to figure out why local people aren't giving. And we finally convened local people and realized that they were giving, you talked about changing, demystifying the language of philanthropy. They were giving to their churches, they were giving to their alma maters, they were giving in places, the hospital where they had touch points. But in terms of like their practice of philanthropy was so different. And when we sat down with them, we were able to engage with them, that conversation was so enlightening for us. And it really shifted how we talk to donors, how we think about our future and a reliance on the old white man donor to drive our work. And so it's, I really was moved by that. I think it's a conversation that needs to happen more often in communities, diverse communities and communities of color. And for those foundations that are serving communities like this, it can express how important it is to get down to the ground and to have those really meaningful conversations. I just love also the conversation about moving from a knowing organization to a learning organization. And that's been a huge part of our evolution. And as we think about even grant making and the work that we're doing with our nonprofits, as we get closer and build really enduring partnerships with them, we don't want the relationship to only be about money. And so we are shifting how we are granting. Strategic grant making is how we talk about it. We don't talk about grant making in and of itself. We grant consortiums, we grant partnerships. And so we don't want them to see us as, the tower on the hill that you go to when you need something. We want them to really be in lockstep with us as we're trying to move change in our community. So I really appreciate the work that CIN is leading, and LaDon, how you've been able to incorporate that work into your foundation. Brad, I'm gonna sort of toss it over to you to kind of like shut it down. And,
I was like, I'm not going to get in the way of this lady because she's on. I was going to let you preach, but I flagged in the chat, just so you all know, Deanna, you were very vulnerable and you shared an amazing story with Global Giving recently, an amazing partner to you and many communities. And so I flagged that in the chat, and I encourage you all to read Deanna's story and take all this to heart. And LaDon, thank you. There's something, every time I listen to LaDon, I've now done, I think we've been together just in the short weeks, like 3 weeks, like I'm just like, I can't wait till she gets going because you're not going to stop her. But you have really led the charge at Denver, and something you said that I think is really important is that this doesn't have to be done by the sole staff member who happens to be Black, right? Like this is they are part of the equation. But could you talk a little bit about what you said there and the importance that we got to be careful not to be tossing it onto their shoulders just because someone is of color, but also we're creating the space for them. Just help me go, because that was a really important lesson that I think we should chat about real quickly, and then we'll wrap up.
Amen. Amen on that. So yes,
which part, the wrapping up or the
no, no, nothing. No, I'm just saying. So I would just ask the folks in this space to just think about how, at least for me, I happen to be a person of color who was super nosy and all on the other side of the room, but most likely, there's still a lot of foundations that are majority white on all sides. And so how, thinking about the relationships that you have with organizations of color and leaders of color and beginning to have those conversations, it's one of the things I think is where CIN played an incredible role for my white colleagues, because what I didn't want to do is become the person for my foundation. Even though I'm involved, obviously, but it's really important that we begin having these conversations. And, I took my white colleagues to the CIN conference. It was really important for me as well. I've taken 2 of the 3 CEOs that we've had in my tenure at the foundation to the conference. It's important for you to be in a room where, I mean, typically I'm the only Black person or very few people of color in a room of white people in our field. And so to be able to put yourself in a space where you have the same experience as me, one is super eye-opening, and two, I think really begins to kind of turn those wheels about this conversation doesn't feel that different than when I'm engaging a potential donor of my foundation who happens to be white. Maybe there's a little bit of a difference, but it's really good to have that exposure and to kind of, if you want to say, have the opportunity to begin to bridge the language. The values are the same. I mean, there's no difference in the values. And this, you know, I kind of, my new term right now, because this work has really led to us actually kind of in light of the 2 pandemics to launch a fund focused on Black resilience. And the first donors of that fund was our first Giving Circle of Colors. So the Black Men's Giving Circle, DAP. They made the first initial investment, and we made sure that it wasn't about putting them on display. It was about recognizing their long-term intentionality of changing the landscape of the community. And they wanted to be the first investors, and they wanted to share their testimony with others. That way of thinking, engagement, has come from the relationship they've built with the Denver Foundation, and also what they've learned from their peers and their networks that have been, I think, connected to them through CIN. So,
LaDon, I'm going to jump in. I
okay,
just want to
go
thank
ahead.
you as always. But, you know, here's the thing, folks. You know, I have mad respect for the Community Investment Network and Marcia. And so this is not to undercut their work. But the point of all this is there are invaluable support networks to help us continue to evolve and help us get this done right. And what I think is almost most impressive is we can learn from each other, right? And to LaDon said this, and I think Dan and some others said this, that people of all different shades are leading really important work on diversifying our community philanthropy at the local level. And so I encourage you to keep doing that. And it can start by just evaluating your own grant making and the difference that it's making, who's ultimately benefiting. That is something that we learned greatly in this time, is that our community foundation field, we don't do a good job of measuring the impact we're having on different demographics in our own community. We talk about grant making only, is it education, public health, is it, you know, climate or something like that. We're not talking about the people. And so this is a great place to start. And I hear the ice cream truck outside, which means that school's out, which means we're at 3 o'clock, which means I need to wrap this up. So I want to thank CEONet. Deanna, you're a rock star, and I thank you so much for being willing to share the stage with me, because I couldn't have done this without you. LaDon, Mike, Mackenzie, Isaiah, thank you. And thanks to all of you who joined us for this recording. And please join us October 29th. We're going to have our public policy team, and we're going to talk about all the crazy things happening at the national level that influence us, from donor advised funds, CARES Act, you name it, universal deductions. And then December 8th, we're going to come back again one more time for the year. And we're going to invite new CEOs to the field. So this is your chance to get to know anyone who is new to the Community Foundation field, but is leading the Community Foundation. We're going to ask them what's on their mind. And then that's where we're going to turn to all of you who have some experience and tenure to enlighten them, to scare them, and to support them in their journey. So with that, thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the week, and much appreciation for all you do.